Hold on. Do one of
All right, welcome everyone. Looks like everyone is on. All right, if you are not presenting, please make sure to mute your microphone. Welcome everyone. So our panel today is on fieldwork challenges of genocide studies research, looking at 3 different case studies. I'm very excited to hear these amazing presenters talk about their challenges. I think it'll be very interesting. So we'll just go ahead and jump in there. We only have 3, so I've told everyone that I will warn them at 17 minutes if they've gone over. That way they can wrap up. So starting with Rachel, is it Killean? How do you?
Killean.
Killean, okay. Senior lecturer in the School of Law and a fellow in the Senator George J. Mitchell Institute for Global Peace and Security and Justice at Queen's University, Belfast. Research is centered around responses to violence and transitions from conflict, with a particular focus on environmental harm and sexual and gender-based violence. So I will turn it over to you, Rachel, and allow you to begin.
Thank you. You'll just have to bear with me while I do the usual getting the PowerPoint thing. So
allow you, let's see. Try now. Should be at the bottom and say that you can share your PowerPoint.
Rachel, I think you're muted.
Can you see that?
No.
Don't worry. I'm gonna do the upload the PDF and sweat profusely.
Rachel, did you put it on slideshow first and then share? Apparently that is a trick.
I did, yeah. But I think I'll just upload the PDF because that did work, right? As we learned.
It sometimes distorts the photos a little bit, but then everyone can follow along.
Okay. Okay, yeah. Feel free to talk amongst yourselves.
It's so very different than the usual, where we all would just be chatting while you sort instead of just being so painfully quiet. So I'll sit here and just talk nonsense the entire time.
Okay, it's just converting, it's processing.
I have to say, yeah, Mel and I just keep going, okay, Barcelona, what are we going to do when we get there?
Yeah, right. Okay, yeah. Is it there?
Yes.
Oh, it just popped up. You're good.
Wonderful. Okay, so thank you so much for inviting me to be part of this panel, particularly to Mel for reaching out. I'm Rachel, I'm from Queens, as was said, and this presentation is a reflection on the last 9 years of research that I've conducted in Cambodia. And I'll be focusing on an overview of my practice and then focusing on the themes of positionality and local partnership. Following Mel's advice, I have changed the presentation slightly away from being about the mistakes I have made into the lessons I have learned. But some of these are also lessons I'm still trying to learn rather than lessons I have mastered. So I thought it was probably, I don't want to talk about myself like too much, but I thought it was probably important to highlight the research that I'm talking about, so the practice that I'm actually discussing. So I've been researching Cambodia since I went there as an intern, as many young folks with an interest in genocide and atrocity studies did, and became interested in victim participation in the Khmer Rouge Tribunal. So I wrote my PhD on that topic, so that explored the experience of victims in participating in the tribunal and how this was shaped by diverse actors and contexts and things like that. After that, I became interested in the Cham minority group, which I was presenting about earlier today, and conducted a collaborative project with colleagues at Queen's, the University of Cambridge, and then an organisation in Cambodia. This looked at the destruction of Cham cultural heritage and their hopes for reparation in that regard. And then after that, shifting focus slightly, I did another collaborative project that looked at representations of victimhood in Tuol and Chhange, two famous genocide memorials and museums in Cambodia. Again, that was collaborative with a local partner. Shifting gears slightly again, I more recently have been involved in a project that uses participatory filmmaking to explore legacies of violence and current challenges for the indigenous Benong community in Cambodia and the captive elephants that form part of that community. And then absolutely most recently, I'm having my first shot at leading a project, which is a project that explores how the concept of human dignity is understood in Cambodia. So this is again collaborative with international co-investigators and a local partner. So there's a common thread, which is the legacies of violence and transition in Cambodia. And there's some methodological commonalities as well. But one thing I just wanted to flag before I highlight some of those is that I'm being kind of vague about collaboration because this is a panel talking about the experience of fieldwork. So normally, as I'll discuss, I think it's really important to acknowledge your collaborators, particularly when they are local collaborators, but I just thought it was best to stay a bit vague. I mean, none of it's secret. You can look up any of these projects now if you wanted, but I'm just going to keep it a bit more vague today. So in terms of what grounds the project, I've preferred semi-structured interviews and focus groups as my primary method. This is diversified slightly in light of the types of projects. So I've engaged in a little bit of filmmaking, so interviews that are also part of a film, and then participatory filmmaking, as I highlighted a moment ago, with Cambodian young people. In terms of the people I've conducted research with, predominantly victims and survivors, but also perpetrators, civil society actors and activists, lawyers, judges, you know, a whole diverse group of people. I don't know how many interviews I've conducted, but I estimate slightly over 200, I think. And then the last thing I wanted to note is that with the exception of my PhD, I think all of these projects actually are funded by the Global Challenges Research Fund, which is a UK branch of their development money, soon to be dramatically cut. In fact, I think it now has been dramatically cut, which is bad news for researchers like myself. But that brings with it special, or particular anyway, requirements around prioritizing local partnership, prioritizing outputs which are accessible, dissemination at a local level, and impact if possible. So these are particular agendas that I'm working within, but also something that I would prioritize anyway, to be honest with you. So the first theme that I wanted to explore with you is positionality. So I agree with Gillian Rose, who wrote that positionality is not static. It's something that is constituted in response to different audiences, demands, and contexts throughout the research process. And I found this obviously to be the case for myself. My positionality differs when I'm talking to a judge in the Khmer Rouge tribunal versus when I'm talking to a Mahout about impacts of deforestation in Mondulkiri. You know, experts, vulnerable communities, women, men, it varies. But I wanted to highlight a couple of the particular aspects of my positionality that have had implications for the way I do research. So first, as is obvious, I am an outsider to Cambodia. I did not know anything when I arrived. I know a tiny bit more now. So what does it mean to be an outsider in Cambodia? You know, I think many of us have probably conducted research in communities which are not where we grew up. So I don't want to overemphasize that point. But I want to share one illustrative story that I experienced that highlighted both how it can be beneficial, but also some of the risks, which is an interview that I was trying to conduct with a civil party, so someone who had participated in the Khmer Rouge Tribunal. And she was very back and forth. So she consent and then withdraw and consent and then withdraw. And over time, we determined even that what was holding her back was not me. She was quite keen to speak to me, but she pointed to my local interpreter and was like, "You're going to leave, but what about him?" So once we just realized what the nature of the problem was, we could talk about it and talk about our ethical practices and confidentiality and all those kinds of things. But for me, this story is illustrative of something that maybe many of us have experienced, which is when you're an outsider, that can sometimes work in your favor, because people will be like, well, I'll tell you my story, because you'll leave, I don't have to worry about what you're going to do with that information. But second, that when you're an outsider, you need to be giving a lot of thought to the local dynamics that might not be so visible to you, and the local relationships that might not be so visible to you. And then a third point would be that researchers, I think, need to be conscious, particularly when we're conducting research connected to atrocity, of the risks of participating in research, which obviously we are aware of, but that these risks don't necessarily end with the end of our research and can stay very real for our participants long after we have flown home and are writing up our very interesting findings. So then I'm an outsider. I'm also from the global north. So I have a lot of educational and economic privilege. I have a lot of power. So again, I don't want to overlabor it, but for me, check and privilege has meant a couple of different things over the course of my time in Cambodia. So one of the things I increasingly think about is that, particularly as I get older, people ask me to participate in research, or they ask me to be interviewed for different things. And I have a lot of time and space to do that. My job allows for that. So one of the things I think about a lot is what is my participant giving up to be here today? And we know that it's ethically difficult if you are rewarding participants. But if your participant is a subsistence farmer or, has other kind of economic restrictions, then I think we need to be conscious of those and really building in reimbursement and making sure no one is worse off for having been in our company. Privilege also manifests in my relationship with my partners, and collaboration is something I'll talk about more. But I think about this in context of my access to journals and things that are stuck behind firewalls, and how we should be pursuing open access, but also sharing things with our Cambodian colleagues whenever we can. I try and do that whenever I can. I also have a lot of funding for nice conferences like this, where I can build my profile. My Cambodian colleagues don't always have those opportunities. So one thing I think about now that I write grant proposals is, can funders provide those opportunities? And if not, can my school provide those opportunities? And how can we help our Global South colleagues also raise their profile? And then institutional backing. If the GCRF is slow to deliver funds to Queen's, that's all right. My salary is secure. My research funding is probably secure as well. They can sub me. But particularly with smaller NGOs, if we're working with partners, for example, in the filmmaking project, some of our partners were not at all wealthy. So if the funder is slow in providing funding to them, or my university is slow in providing funding for them, that has real implications for their ability to pay their staff. So these kinds of privileges need to be really ingrained, and I try and think about them a lot as I continue to operate in Cambodia. The next aspect of my positionality is that I am a young-ish woman. I was young when I started. I was 23. I'm not 23 now. I'll leave it there. And this has impacted my experience of doing interviews. So I have experienced in Cambodia that men are not as open to being interviewed by me. Men who are older, this becomes more pronounced. Men who are older and are in positions of power, most pronounced. This is also probably not unique to me. On the counter to that is that some of my experiences of interviewing women, both young and old, have been incredible. I don't know if this is gender solidarity, like I'm just, anecdotally sharing with you here, but some of the interviews I've had with Cambodian women have been really profound and important. So I have to think about how that has influenced the directions that my research has taken, the findings that I've made, and the kind of perspective that I'm getting access to. Someone else might get very different access to. As I've become more collaborative, this has been countered to some extent by having, more senior male colleagues and different people working with me, but it's certainly something that shapes my experience. And then I am specifically someone who researches transitional justice. And in Cambodia, transitional justice in the formal process of the ECCC has been ongoing for the duration of my research. So when I research issues to do with transitional justice, I have to engage in a very specific form of expectation management, because as a white kind of legal scholar, when I rock up, participants can quickly and fairly assume that I am connected to the court in some way. So I, in early days, was often asked, can you make the court speed up, please? It's taking too long. Can you help us write this reparation request? Latterly, it has shifted to more like, can you do this fundraising for us? Or can you deliver this particular output? So as a researcher, I have to understand the kind of white person that has been rocking up to these communities and what they're asking for. And when it's possible, I try and say yes. So for example, in the CHAM research project, there were frequent requests for more information about CHAM history. So we have access, as I said, to resources and things that meant we could put together a little pamphlet about CHAM history and how they came to be in Cambodia and deliver that. But usually they're asking for something much more profound, and it's not something we can give. So I have to manage that. And then from a more practical perspective, I am not a native English speaker. And this has gone wrong. It's gone very wrong, kind of wrong, and sometimes it's okay. So when it's gone very wrong, when I was first a PhD student, I had a really lovely gatekeeper who was helping me access some civil parties, but he did not tell me that those civil parties were ethnic Vietnamese with limited Khmer language skills. So I turned up with my interpreter and had a very surreal kind of multiple miscommunication experience. So it's really good to check what language your participants are going to be speaking. I haven't made that mistake again. It can also go kind of wrong. In Cambodia, some of the key concepts that I've worked with do not so easily translate in Cambodia. So a key one that many of you actually probably are aware of is reparations. Is tricky to explain. But also when we were researching dark tourism, my colleagues and I gave this like, kind of local dissemination presentation to kind of civil society and students and educators in Cambodia, thinking we were super cool, like doing local dissemination. And then the first question was like, what are you talking about? Like, what is dark tourism? So thinking about how concepts translate as well as words. And sometimes it can work in interesting ways. So for example, again, in the dark tourism project, a lot of our participants were telling us we are the living document of the past. Well, were they actually telling us that, or was that how the civil society organization we were working with was translating it? Was an interesting question that took a little bit of time to dig into. What I learned from this is that you can just center translation into your projects, and that can be super interesting. So in the Human Dignity Project, it's premised on the fact that some imported human rights concepts have not been so easily understood in Cambodia. And we can make translation central both to our research, but also to our relationship with our partner. So how are we talking to each other? How are they explaining things to us like non-Khmer speakers, and how are we navigating that? So these are all just parts of who I am that influence how I do research. So the second theme then is partnership. So as I said, all of the projects I've been involved in since my PhD are GCRF funded, so actually partnership is a requirement, but it's also a privilege and a joy. I love collaborating with Cambodian partners. So these are just some reflections on how that's gone. Sometimes it goes well and sometimes it has really not gone well. So centering collaboration. I have found that when I have gone with a complete idea to a partner, it can be okay, but the research that I have really, really enjoyed is so much better when there's a degree of co-design, and the earlier co-design comes in, the better. I haven't had the luxury of a fully bottom-up designed project because, as I was talking with my co-investigator about this, like grant deadlines and things don't always allow for that. But asking early on, what would you like to get out of this? Are you actually interested in this, or are you just, helping us out? Can be really super important and can really make the difference between a local researcher who is helping you, research assistants, and someone who is collaborating with you, which is much more fruitful and rewarding, I think. So now that I'm entering my first experience of leading a project, I'm really trying to ground that in. I host a lot of meetings. Some might say too many meetings. And I think a lot about who's talking in those meetings. So I have 2 senior Western professors on the research team, and I have to spend a lot of time trying to make them be quiet and give our Cambodian colleagues the space to speak, because they can be differential to these senior profs. And encouraging an approach of backing off. Westerners don't always need to be taking up space, but that's quite hard to unlearn. Power dynamics and partnership I've found manifesting in really diverse ways. So obviously there's power between myself and a Cambodian partner organization. I'm often coming in with the money, but I don't have the connections. So power is not something that's just one way or another. It shifts and moves over the course of the project, depending on what stage we're at and what's going on. But also power is something that exists between organizations in Cambodia. There's a lot of contests around access to funds and space, and not fully understanding those can lead to interesting conversations about why we can't access that participant, or why we're not invited to this event, or why these people won't come to our events. So that's just been something to navigate. But also power within. Yeah, you're going to give me a warning, aren't you, Steph?
17 minutes.
Yeah, that's fine. I'm nearly wrapping up anyway. So within organizations as well, Cambodian society is still quite hierarchical. So navigating that, not accidentally stepping on someone's toes. Occasionally, I've reframed an output in light of a little bit of tension within an organization. And as being an outsider, as I said, this is something that's quite difficult to understand and to adapt to. So I found the more Cambodian friends I can speak to, and the more researchers who are also engaged in Cambodia, the better. And I'm really fortunate to be connected to so many other researchers who are doing important work in Cambodia. So the importance of community is really key here. So a few more points and then I'll stop. So clarifying goals. I was out in the provinces with my local collaborator, and we were interviewing a survivor. And he got really interested in the conversation. He was asking loads of questions, and I was like, oh yeah, this is going to be a really great interview. I can't wait to read the transcript. And when we got the transcript, he had got interested in something totally separate from our research project, and had gone this deep dive into the history of the area, which was like super interesting, but nothing to do with the project. So clarifying goals at the start can be useful, both in terms of the content, the minimum content, and in mind that he asked these questions, but we didn't get out of it what we needed to get out of it, and also who's being contacted. So and on one previous project, we had to talk about gender balance, for example. Those kinds of things can be helpful to clarify at the start. And then ethical parameters and ethics of care is about how ethics works in multiple ways. So for ethical parameters, under Queen's ethical constraints, there's certain things that I would not be permitted to ask. So for example, in the UK, you can't ask about a crime that's been perpetrated that has not been convicted, but that might not occur to a Cambodian local partner. Equally, there might be particular ways to talk about sexual violence, for example, that are culturally specific, and then I need to learn about that from my local partner. But then ethics of care also applies to my local Cambodian colleagues, because unlike me, they may have lost loved ones through the genocide or the subsequent conflict. And the impact even of doing this kind of research can be profound on them in a way that it's not for me. So I had a junior researcher from a partner organization, after we had been out in the provinces for a while, started talking to us about his father, and how he believed his father had been a perpetrator, and the legacy this had played out in his family. So what do we do there? We have to listen, we have to be empathetic, and we have to give that researcher space, but just be conscious that for a Cambodian research in Cambodia, the stakes are different and higher in many ways. And then finally, outputs and acknowledgement. Reflecting collaboration, I think, it's good to design your outputs in light of what your partners are thinking about, or your Cambodian colleagues might want out of it, both in terms of academic and not academic. That's how I ended up in film originally, not the participatory film, but a different film. When people contribute, acknowledge them, not just in a footnote. If they wrote something, they should be an author. And then citations are political. So something I've been thinking about a lot at the moment is all the wonderful Cambodian researchers that are coming up, putting things out into the world, and how your recognition of your partner and your collaborators can extend beyond the project and really be something that you can ingrain in your writing whenever. Just think about, I think about the fact that I get a lot from Cambodia. How can I do more to platform Cambodian colleagues when possible? So in conclusion then, if any of this verged on preaching, again, I apologize. This is not lessons I've learned. These are lessons I'm learning and things that I've been thinking about. And I've made a lot of mistakes, a lot. But what I wanted to offer here were some of the key lessons that I've learned and the principles that I'm trying to implement as I continue my research engagement in Cambodia. I agree with Darling here that it is only by practicing and critically thinking about fieldwork that we can improve both in terms of ethics and sensitivity. And I agree with Madeline Gozi that critical self-reflexivity is the absolute least we owe participants and partners. And then my final thought is that Westerners like myself have to continue to do the work of learning to learn, and that we need to keep practicing humility and reminding ourselves to practice humility and appreciate the different knowledge that our Cambodian or wherever our partners, our participants, our organizations that we work with can bring. And in doing that, we improve both the research process and the research outcome. And I'll stop there. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Rachel. And our next presentation will be Sara Brown. And Sara Brown is the Executive Director of Chhange, the Center for Holocaust, Human Rights, and Genocide Education. Brown holds the first PhD in Comparative Genocide Studies from Clark University's Strassler Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies. She's worked and conducted research in Rwanda since 2004 and is the author of Gender and the Genocide in Rwanda, Women as Perpetrators and Rescuers, and the co-editor of the forthcoming Routledge Handbook on Religion, Mass Atrocity, and Genocide. All right, and you said you didn't have a PowerPoint, correct?
I did not, no.
Okay. All right, then I will turn it over to you now.
Let's see, I'm going to reduce this screen and hopefully everyone can see me. Hi, everyone, and good afternoon, good evening, good morning, wherever you are in the world. Thank you, Stephanie, for moderating. Thank you, Mel, for conceiving of this really interesting panel. And thank you, Rachel, for giving me a lot to think about. I was taking notes as you went along and also was nodding a lot in agreement. And I want to reiterate what Rachel just said, that I really hope that this talk doesn't come off as preachy, because it was something that I was trying very hard to avoid. But at the same time, I did want to share, as Mel correctly pointed out, not the mistakes, but the lessons learned. But I also spent a lot of time thinking about how to open this talk, and I decided it's probably best to start at the beginning when I had no idea what I was doing. Though in my defense, I like to think that what I lacked in knowledge and experience, maybe I made up for in enthusiasm, maybe not. I first traveled to Rwanda in the summer of 2004, and I was in between my junior and senior years at university. I'd never traveled to the continent of Africa, never mind Rwanda. And what, similar to what Rachel had said, it started with an internship. I had cold emailed a number of organizations in search of an internship over the summer. And when one of them replied, I was elated, and I quickly got to work mapping out a project with them. The logistics of my stay were a little bit fuzzy, but my contact at the organization assured me that I'd be all set. So off I embarked on a 30+ hour flight. Back then, it was quite a circuitous route to get to Rwanda. And I had way too much luggage and a travel guide for Rwanda that was filled with highlighted items, handwritten notes, and whatever tips and research I had picked up along the way. This is all pre-smartphone. And so that book was to be my lifeline. I still remember what it felt like that first time that I arrived in Kigali. And that moment still sits with me, even though I lack the poetic ability to bring to life what was that first impression with the colors and the people and the lights and the sounds. And it was just a deeply impactful moment. I met my contact at the airport, a wonderful young man, and we headed to my accommodations for the next 7 weeks. Now, without my knowing, my contact had very generously decided to give me the room he rented behind a set of shops that was near town, and he planned to stay with family members. And without getting into too many of the details, it was immediately apparent that the accommodations weren't going to work for a woman traveling alone, and especially one with no grasp of the local language, Kinyarwanda. I was in a bit of a delicate situation, though, as I tried to explain my predicament to my contact, who was also going to be my internship coordinator and had just offered me his home to stay in. Somehow we managed. And so when my mother called a few hours later to find out if I had landed okay, I greeted her with, "Hi, everything is fine. Don't panic. I need you to wire me $600. I'm moving into a convent with nuns." Now, my mom and I still laugh about that phone call, and she very gamely sent me the money and did not, much to my surprise, panic. And neither did I. I had done enough advanced research that even though I could never have anticipated this situation, I was able to panic. And most importantly, I was able to I was able to pivot. And most importantly, I was able to not panic. And that was something I kept thinking about when trying to prepare this talk, is like, if there's one thing I could have people take away from it, maybe it's that, like, prepare well enough for whatever your research, travel, internship experience is going to be, so that when, and it's definitely when, not if, things go awry, either a little bit or a lot, you can pivot and, to the best of your ability, calmly and quickly. And then another thing that I was thinking about, and this is maybe my second big takeaway, is to learn the difference between being entitled and self-advocating. And then try to have the cultural sensitivity to avoid the former without ever sacrificing the latter. So years later, I had the great fortune to do my doctoral work in Rwanda, and this time I had a little bit more experience and a lot less luggage. I was, and I remain, deeply influenced by Cynthia Enlow's tremendous body of work. And in one piece in particular, Enlow likens concepts to flashlights. And this had a really big impression on me. Basically, the idea is, if you have a good concept, it will help you to see the corners of a previously darkened room. But a bad concept will distort the shapes, or it's going to be too weak to fully illuminate those corners. And it's a brilliant way to gauge theories and concepts. And I quickly discovered that with my study, my doctoral work examined the role of women during the 1994 genocide against the Tutsi. I ended up doing a comparative study between rescuers and perpetrators. I realized that I was going to need a customized set of concepts, a customized flashlight. So I set about building this flashlight that would illuminate the corners of my intended area of study. Now, I wove together findings that I would gather from my field research, along with what was, by that point, more than 7 years of field experience. And together, I developed a modified grounded theory that included inductive and deductive components. And I did a very deep dive into how best to conduct research with human subjects around a highly traumatic and traumatizing topic. I also spent quite a bit of time reflecting on my role in the interviews, and this is going to mimic a little bit of what Rachel was saying before, although I would argue that Rachel put it much more eloquently. But I was not a passive observer, just asking questions and taking notes. My presence and my gender, my race, my nationality, they all impacted the interviewee, and as a result, the interview overall. Now, similar to what Rachel was saying, I found that my gender tended to weigh in favor of my research. And I was interviewing predominantly women. And so I found that there was a similar camaraderie and solidarity. But I also found that my Jewish identity tended to also weigh in favor of my research, especially with the survivor community. In a number of instances, so much so that it kind of became its own data point, a number of the survivors would actually express relief, assuming that I was better situated to understand their experience of genocide because of the Holocaust. And they would often ask me questions about if I had lost family members, and suddenly this sense of shared solidarity seemed to also positively impact their willingness to share with me. Now, my race and nationality, though, were clearly problematic, and there was an obvious power imbalance that cut across so many different layers, and even more so when I was interviewing incarcerated women. At the end of the conversation, I was able to get up and leave, and they could not. And I sometimes wondered if, no matter how many times I told them they could, they realized that just because they couldn't leave the camp, they also, that didn't mean that they couldn't leave the interview. I sometimes worried and would even reiterate to them, if at any point you want to stop this conversation, we can. And I just don't know if that always translated, given the situation that they were already in, already incarcerated, already unable to move freely and make their own choices. But at some point, I also grasped that it was my responsibility to take, yes, meaningful measures to counteract these and other factors, but I also realized that I could easily talk myself out of even doing this research. So yes, I was coming into these interviews from a position of power and privilege. I had to own it, but I also didn't want to let it define my interactions. So I took what measures I could. I constantly adjusted and amended based on the circumstances and the needs of the interviewees. And I did my best because in the end, it really wasn't about me. In a way, I kind of had to get out of the way of my own work. While many of my efforts were successful, I did, sorry, Mel, make mistakes or learn lessons along the way. I had a few of them that popped up in my mind as I was drafting some comments about what I wanted to talk about. One was losing my temper at a misogynist head of one of the incarceration camps. I also, when listening to my taped recordings of interviews that I had conducted, I would often cringe at every and I would worry if the questions, my tone, my mannerisms possibly had negatively impacted my interviewees. I took many wrong turns and I also made cultural blunders. And early on in my research, I really overlooked my need for self-care. And that's another topic that I want to address a little bit here. Lori Ann Perlman was actually the one who first pointed it out to me. And to her, I owe a great deal of gratitude. She's a tremendous clinical psychologist and a scholar, and she pulled me aside at a conference after my first round of in-country research, and she very gently asked me, "Are you seeing a therapist?" And at the time, I remember being really surprised at her question and maybe a little bit defensive because immediately, and unfortunately, this is me adopting a stigma around mental health and self-care, I immediately assumed that meant there was something wrong with me, and I've absolutely changed my perspective since then. But she persisted, which I just appreciate on so many levels. She explained to me the high risk of vicarious trauma, a psychological effect of working with people who experience genocide, either as survivors, bystanders, rescuers, or even perpetrators. Now, given Lori helped coin that phrase, she knew what she was talking about. And I decided to write into my research plans regular sessions with a therapist. And I also started paying attention to my own early warning signs when I was starting to show signs of some vicarious stress, vicarious trauma. And this was especially when I was abroad and I wasn't regularly meeting with my therapist. And as a sidebar, I just want to note that the pandemic did normalize this idea of teletherapy, which I think is an incredible tool and one that hopefully will benefit those doing in-country research when they're not able to access their usual therapist, in an in-person way. Maybe there's teletherapy options as well. Because for me, in Rwanda, that wasn't an option. So I found that regular sleep, exercise, and support from friends and family and colleagues all helped. And sometimes it was enough to just say, I am not okay, and embrace that experience rather than bottling it up and barreling towards my next interview. Now, a little bit about my actual research. I tried my best to foreground women's narratives into my research and analysis. And that may seem deceptively easy, like just add women and stir. But it's not. Along the way, I really learned that a nuanced gender analysis included not only navigating those dominant discourses that marginalized women in theoretical terms, but also in practical terms and in my own work. And here it feels really obvious, but ethical research is good research. We should try to do our very best to do no harm or mitigate the harm our research may cause as we navigate very delicate and highly charged landscapes like genocide or communities that have experienced or are experiencing mass atrocity. On one of my first in-country research trips, I met a survivor of the genocide against the Tutsi. Her name was Margaret. That's obviously not her real name, but one that I assigned to her later. Now, Margaret managed to survive the massacres at Murambe in southwestern Rwanda, and she had even managed to rescue her infant daughter from the Interahamwe killing militias. And her testimony included this story of heroism, but also the devastating murder of her 2 sons and husband, the tremendous bloodshed and violence that she witnessed, and also nearly being murdered when she refused to give up her daughter. Telling her story clearly had a traumatic impact on her, even though she had volunteered to share it. And at the end of our conversation, I asked one of the last of my many semi-structured and kind of deliberately open-ended questions, was there anything further she wished to share? And at that point, Margaret thanked me for allowing her to tell her entire story from start to finish, and without interrupting her or asking her to hurry it up. And then she kind of explained, almost as an aside, an afterthought, that almost everyone she met with did that, and it often made her feel sad. Now, I'm still angry about when I think about that moment. Margaret was giving me her time and sharing her life story and trauma, and likely re-traumatizing herself to some extent, all to benefit my research. Now, given the emotional toll that sharing that testimony had and the practical cost of giving up half a day of work, she was a farmer, just to meet me, it seems like listening without interrupting was the very least I could do. But I also want to take it a step further and challenge all of us. And again, I'm so sorry if this comes off as preachy, but we should be engaged listeners. Give the people who are sharing their stories with us when we're doing research with human subjects, we should give them our full and undivided attention. Anything less not only does a disservice to you and your research, but you'll invariably miss something if you're not paying full attention, but it's also disrespectful. And I worry that it could contribute to the continuum of violence that is experienced by many witnesses of genocide. And in my case, it would have meant marginalizing the experiences of the very women whose experiences I was trying to foreground in my work. Now, even as I have tried my best to empower the women I was interacting with, I probably should note that I often had my own agency challenged, especially in the Chhange incarceration camps I visited. These were, the ones that I visited were all run by men at the time and extremely hierarchical, with power exercised by a select few, exclusively male, really. In some instances, my arrival at the camp kind of became this opportunity for those men in power to flex their power in uncomfortable and highly performative ways. It was pretty normal for me to be forced to wait for an extremely long period of time, even though there seemed to be no apparent reason. Often my interviews would be interrupted for no purpose except for them to show that they could, or they would even flaunt the permissions that I had by limiting my access to the women I was to interview. Now, I generally manage these situations by remaining calm and politely obstinate, and having the head of the Chhange camp's cell phone at the ready in case I needed to make a call. And this usually worked, but as I noted before, I did lose my temper one time. And it did result in a pretty uncomfortable standoff between me and the camp commander. And he eventually did revoke my access in a very loud and brash way in front of the women that I was to interview. Lesson learned. Though I'm not sorry. Now, as each of us quickly learned during in-country research, the plans that we lay out in elaborate detail back home do often go awry. And there were days when I woke up at the crack of dawn in Kigali only to find that once I was showered, dressed, fed, out the door, ready for my meeting, that meeting was no more. A last minute call to attend Parliament, the arrival of a VIP, or one of a million possible legitimate excuses, since often in Rwanda saying, no, I just don't feel like meeting you isn't really a culturally acceptable response. All of these could ambush a given day. And then there were the days where I would venture forth for the day expecting lines, delays. Can you please come back? I have a conference call in 5 minutes. These last minute cancellations, and my limited expectations would be exceeded, or one of those last minute cancellations would free up an afternoon and I would be able to just randomly drop by the MONUSCO offices and end up receiving a 3-hour-long security briefing about the Democratic Republic of the Congo. All of this is to say that there's a time for flexibility. I'm not really blessed with patience, but I do try to tackle those days by not with patience, but maybe with a little bit of humor and flexibility. And in a way that goes back to that pivot point, being ready to pivot and not getting locked into one plan. One thing I did find in the MINUSCO office's story is a real one, but it ended up being one of those moments where the best things that happen sometimes are when your plans go awry or something pops up unexpectedly. And then another thing I'd like to talk about a little bit is that I was fortunate that during my time in Rwanda, I made many close friends, and I eventually moved in with a Rwandan family with whom I had become close. And living with a family was a wonderful experience for a number of reasons. But when talking about my research, it also provided all of these insights into day-to-day life that I otherwise would have missed. And with it, I think a chance to better understand the nuanced and wonderfully complicated country that I was trying to analyze. Given that my topic was gender and agency, every day provided these little vignettes into the myriad spaces and places that girls and women were navigating in Rwanda. And there was one time, little story, that I got to go to a graduation party for a young woman who had just completed her undergraduate degree. And it was also a chance to watch the gender revolution happening in real time and with some very awkward missteps. The party wasn't exactly what I expected from a traditional graduation party. It was more like a Texan evangelical tent revival combined with trial court. The guests filed in, they arranged themselves in rows under a tent, and then the graduate sat stiffly in her cap and gown, completely silent, alongside family members on the porch. Now, with my halting in Rwanda, I was able to grasp maybe a fraction of what was said, and then my friends filled in the rest for me. And as is often the case in Rwanda, with events in Rwanda, there was an order to the evening. Speeches, gospel songs, more speeches, buffet food, more speeches, a few jokes made by an MC. And then finally, the uncle, the male head of the household, gave what we thought would be the final speech. There were a few more prayers, a few more hymns, and then we got ready to leave. But this is when the young woman in the cap and gown unexpectedly got up to speak. And I was so excited because I was worried that she was going to be sidelined at her own party. And then she took it one step further. In the midst of thanking everyone for coming, which was apparently not according to the plan, if you saw the facial expressions of her family members, she then decided to introduce her new fiancé amid very loud expressions of shock, gasps, and a few smatterings of applause. And then she invited him up to the porch to also speak. Now, in Rwanda, when couples decide to marry, custom dictates a certain choreographed series of events. More modern couples forego it, but in this instance, what it appeared to be was that this couple was going to hijack a graduation party and turn it into an introduction ceremony. So we got to watch from under the tent in somewhat amused horror as the fiance botched the entire operation. And after about 20 minutes of rambling and a failed attempt to introduce the families, he was basically told to shut up and sit down. And the uncle was beside himself, and I could see that the young graduate knew she was in so much trouble. Now, we eventually snuck out, still choking back tears from laughing so hard. But I still think about that young woman, and I sometimes wonder what her small act of rebellion achieved and also what it cost her. And that memory of that night and her bravery in the face of her family, her community, tradition, in all caps, it still sits with me. And I like to think that it adds to the conceptual lens through which I view my research and my work.
Right. Sarah, we're about a little over 18 minutes.
Excellent. I'm almost done. That's great. Now, in the end, I'm not sure that I have much to teach anyone, as I'm still shaping and honing my research skills, kind of echoing a little bit of what Rachel was saying about, learning to learn and it always being a bit of a process. But I did do a little digging through prior emails, and I found one that I sent right before the start of Kwibuka 27 years ago. It's a little bit personal, but this is how I'd like to close my talk. I was reflecting out to some families and friends, and I wrote, I realized that there have been a few weeks of silence on my part. It's tough to sit down sometimes and put into words the more intense aspects of my research. There are some days when, after 4 interviews with incarcerated women and a tour of the grounds, I just don't have much to say. These interviews require a considerable amount of effort. navigating the interviews, pulling details and insights into women's mobilization and sensitization to participate in genocide, and from women who deny their very involvement, it's challenging. And at the end of the day, I haven't much left in me to share, or it's pushed too deep down to retrieve immediately. Most of the time, I drive back to Kigali with Susan, my translator, and our car is quieter than usual. My interviews with rescuers and survivors are very different. I wouldn't call them better or easier. They are incredibly harrowing. And after these interviews, opposite to my reaction to perpetrators, I have a lot to say, but it's disorganized and confused by the jumble of emotions I simultaneously experience. I am often anxious, even frightened for their safety. Today, many rescuers are reticent to recount their heroic acts for fear of their communities. Those who have come forward and received recognition often face threats and hostility from their neighbors, many of whom participated in the genocide and resent the rescuers' acts. It's a lot to take in, and I am biased in my own way. I remain aware that I am a participant observer here in Rwanda. I'm experiencing and reacting to events even as I am describing and analyzing them. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Sara, for an amazing presentation. Both presentations have been amazing today. I'm very excited for this panel. Our third presentation promises to be just as amazing. And so I'll welcome Mel. So Melanie O'Brien is a senior lecturer in international law at the University of Western Australia and the incoming president of IAGS. Congratulations. Her research examines the connection between human rights and the genocide process and sexual exploitation by peacekeepers. She's conducted fieldwork and research across 6 continents. Her work on forced marriage has been cited by the International Criminal Court, and she's been an expert advisor on genocide prevention for the UN Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. All right, let's just make sure that you have, trying to click
The secret
on,
button.
yes, hold on. There's, your name is there twice, and I have to click on the right name to get the secret button. There you go.
Okay.
All right, I'll turn it over to you.
Hopefully that's working. I can still see Rachel's slide. Oh, there we go. Great. Okay. So in the panel today, we organised our presentations in chronological order of the genocides that we are researching. So Cambodia first from the 1970s, Rwanda from the 1990s, and then as Stephanie mentioned, I've done research fieldwork across 6 continents. So I have done a lot of fieldwork across a lot of different countries, the Holocaust, Armenian genocide, Bosnia, Cambodia, and so on. But I wanted to talk about the Rohingya because it's quite different to do research when we're talking about a current genocide. It's extremely different, and there are a lot of different challenges, significantly different challenges that I faced with this compared to other research that I have done in other areas. But before I get into it, I just wanted to acknowledge that I am speaking to you all from Wajak Noongar Budja or Wajak Noongar country, and I pay my respects to elders past, present, and future. So there are 3 main issues that I wanted to raise throughout my presentation, and they will be ethics, safety, and gender in terms of talking about the challenges. So obviously it's essentially not really possible to go into Myanmar and interview Rohingya in there. So our options now are to interview those who have fled the country as refugees. So I was lucky enough to be invited to a conference at the Liberation War Museum, and but I only found out 2 months ahead that I was going, and that time is quite significant, which I'll come to in a moment. So in addition, I was also actually going to Bosnia. So I flew to Bosnia and I did a conference and field work there. And then I flew to Bangladesh and did a conference and field work there in the one trip, which is all relevant, which I'll get to in a moment. So the first thing is that I was lucky enough to have contacts on the ground through the wonderful Liberation War Museum. And honestly, it really would be impossible without that. I also had some other contacts who work for humanitarian agencies who they personally had been in Cox's Bazar previously, but that organisation still had people there at the moment, and so they were able to put me in contact with the people that they had worked with. So without those contacts on the ground, honestly, you could never manage to do this. Like, it would just be so incredibly difficult given the circumstances of it. So there are a lot of logistics around, which I'm also going to talk through. So the first one was, of course, the travel logistics. As I said, I was actually flying to Bosnia and then to Bangladesh. And so I had to work out what I was doing and the time I could take, especially within the funding constraints that I had. But then also the travel logistics, because obviously the conference was in Dhaka and I needed to get to Cox's Bazar. So I had to arrange all of that and work out travel there. So flying to Cox's Bazar from Dhaka. I also had to work out my accommodation logistics, which turned out to be not as straightforward as I had thought at the time, although once I got there, it kind of was. So I was looking for hotels there and I couldn't seem to find anything. So I was back and forth chatting with the Liberation War Museum, and they said, oh, we'll find you something. And so I'll come back to that as well. But the biggest issue was my ethics application. So as I mentioned, I only found out 2 months before that I was going. Now, normally when I do field work, I plan a really long way ahead, and I do my ethics application a really long way ahead. So in this case, I only had 2 months to prepare it. So I actually had to do 2 ethics applications, one for my Rohingya research and one for the research in Bosnia. I technically could have done it as one, but I wanted to separate them just for the ease of the approval and the use of the particular content that I was getting in Bosnia and getting in Bangladesh. So I had these 2 ethics applications in, and it was just terrible because the university that I work at has these deadlines, and I basically missed one deadline for the ethics committee to review them by, I think it was a day or 2. And I wrote to the office and I said, could it please be reviewed in the next committee meeting rather than the one after that? And I explained why. I said, look, this is when my dates are. I also explained to them that it wasn't just me being lazy, that I didn't leave my ethics application to the last minute, but that, you know, I really only found out 2 months before I was going, and that, of course, I then had to actually work with my partners on the ground in terms of, you know, what I would be able to do. So I had to have those details in the ethics application. You can't, you know, you can't produce an ethics application in a couple of days. It doesn't work that way. But they refused, even though the committee wasn't meeting for another few weeks. So I actually had to wait weeks before the committee even met. So there I was in Bosnia on the morning of my first interview in Bosnia, and that was when my ethics approval came through for Bosnia, on the morning. So it was a huge panic. So then I still didn't have the approval for Bangladesh, but amazingly it came through the next day. And basically this was only because I was essentially harassing the ethics office about it. But one of the issues, and this is a really important thing that I want to raise, was the content of ethics in this concept of Western ethics and what we think it is. So Sara was talking about researching within ethics, which is of course really important, but something that I discovered is that our ethics are designed, essentially what they have in mind when they think about our ethics structure and our ethics approval are Western projects, so in the global north, with literate people who are agreeing to participate in, say, some kind of health or medical experiment. That's essentially what they have in mind. And so the strict structure around ethics doesn't allow them to think outside the box. And they had sent me a page with 24 questions relating to my ethics application, which I've never had before at other universities. I've never had issues, but this one seems to have a lot of issues. So I had to deal with some of those, and some of the questions were really, really patronising as well, particularly with regards to Bosnia, and they also just showed a complete lack of awareness. So for example, they wrote about Bosnia, oh, will you be safe? You know, it's not safe in Bosnia. And I wrote back and I was like, what are you talking about? Like, are you referring to the conflict which ended in the 1990s? You know, like some of their responses were just quite extraordinary, and as I said, patronising. So one of the things that they made me do, and this has relevance later that I'll come back to, was, of course, when you do ethics, you have to have a participant information form, and you also have a consent form that participants have to sign. So in both the cases, they wanted me to get those forms translated. And so with regards to Bangladesh, luckily the Liberation War Museum, they found someone to translate that document for me into Bangla, which I will come back to a little bit later in this presentation. So that was, all of this was part of what was so time consuming and meaning that the ethics was approved so late. So it was quite a lot of work. So this was all happening before I even got there, this huge amount of work, and even still going on while I was doing my conference and field work in Bosnia, where I was also, I was interviewing women who were victims of forced marriage there. So then after Dhaka, I got to, well, first of all, we started in Dhaka. The first thing is the bureaucracy and the permissions needed. So obviously researching in a refugee camp is nothing like, researching with survivors where the genocide happened a very long time ago. So they're in a refugee camp. It's not a tourist destination. You do need permission to go there. So the Liberation War Museum helped me with that. So I had a letter of permission from, I think it was like the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. So then I got myself down to Cox's Bazar. The accommodation logistics were a bit of a challenge. The place that I was put in, I didn't quite feel particularly safe, and it was extremely noisy. So I just didn't get any sleep. So I ended up finding another place which I felt safer in, but honestly also was pretty noisy. So that was a problem in terms of thinking about, getting a decent night's sleep, because they're really long days when you're doing research there, really long days, because the camps are actually a really long way away from Cox's Bazar. It's a really long drive on really bad roads. So it's sort of not just next door to Cox's Bazar and, you can wake up half an hour before or anything like that. They're hugely long days, and you're only allowed to be in the camps between certain hours. So you need to make sure that you're up at a particular time, that you have enough time to get to the camps so that you can maximize your time in the camps and you get back. And you don't stop for lunch or anything like that. You are on the go all day. The Liberation War Museum was also amazing enough to organise a driver and a car for me, and also interpreters. Because of the late notice, I had multiple interpreters. I would have preferred just to have one, particularly the first one I had, who was really great. So, and I should preface, it goes without saying that I paid for all of these things. This is not, obviously, it would be unethical of me to have not done that. So safety getting to the camp, I'll jump to that in a moment on the next slide. But just sort of to mention the gender dimensions in the area and safety. As a woman, being in a country that's extremely patriarchal can be incredibly uncomfortable. And I would be in hotels or restaurants and there wouldn't be a single other woman. And I chose to go to one meeting that I had with some humanitarian workers. I chose to walk there because it was very close by my hotel, and I never did that again, because even though I was completely covered up, I was dressed appropriately. The amount of verbal abuse that I received on that probably 8-minute walk was quite extreme. So after that, I just took one of the little tuk-tuk cars and I hid in the back and I pulled my scarf over my face so that nobody could see who I was, because it made me feel obviously incredibly uncomfortable and really unsafe. In terms of safety, getting to the camp, it's really lucky that we didn't have an accident, to be honest. And obviously our safety is important, and it sort of, sometimes I think our universities would probably not even approve of our travel if they knew how unsafe it was. Yes, I can't believe we didn't have an accident. But just to move on to the more substantial elements of it. So I mentioned the camp bureaucracy and permission. So it turned out that the letter that I had from the MFA wasn't actually what I needed to get into the camps. That in fact, really, I should have got stamps from about 9 different offices and had a particular form. But somehow I managed to blag it every day getting into the different camps. So the Kutupalong camps, it's a conglomeration of camps. It's not just one camp. And so we would go to different camps each day. And when you look at the maps, you'll see it's quite a long shape, and the ones at the top have a lower number that starts from camp 1, and the numbers increase as you go down. So the camps number 1 are the older ones, and they have better facilities because they have been there for longer. So they're more established. And as you go down the bottom, things get a lot worse there. So we would go to different camps, and each camp has what's called a camp in charge. But what that means is the man in charge of the camp, and it's a Bangladeshi man who's in charge of each camp. And you have to go to him, and you have to ask permission to get in. And they would look at my form, and when I did this the first time, I was genuinely doing this, but obviously after a while, when I realized that I really should have had a different form, I put on a performance. So I played up being a dumb woman, and I said, but I was given this from the ministry, and I was told that this was all I would need. So that was genuinely what I said on the first visit, because that was what I was told. But it worked every time, and it worked like a charm. So I was able to get in. But one place where there were a couple of camps I had a bit of an issue. One camp I was in, we'd seen them, yep, we're here, no problem, you can go. And I was in the middle of a really amazing interview with a woman, and some random people who were working in the camp came by, and they took issue with us, even though we were literally just sitting talking to this woman. And it was a bit of a power trip for them. And so they said, no, you have to go back to the camp in charge. And so we just had to go back and repeat the same thing again. Anyway, at another camp, what was a problem was that there were some men who claimed they were from the military, and they wanted to take our photos on their phones. And I refused because I didn't know who they were. They weren't in uniform. They didn't show any ID. And I think they were quite shocked that a woman would dare refuse their request. So they were claiming, oh, we want to take your photo for your safety. But of course, as I said, I didn't know who they were, and I didn't want these strange men to have my photo. So in that camp, I was actually going, if you see in the slide here down in the middle, I'm with a lawyer, Razia Sultana, and that's her women's centre that she has set up. So I was with her, and we were walking. It was quite a distance to walk to her women's centre, and these men followed us the whole way. And then they came into the women's centre, which of course was incredibly inappropriate because it's meant to be a women's centre and a women's safe space. And they watched, and it was really quite funny because I and my interpreter, of course, were literally just watching and doing nothing. So the picture that you see in the bottom right corner is the women in the women's centre who were doing activities with a Korean NGO that works with the women in there. And so we were literally just standing around and watching them and learning what they do. And so I think these two men, whether they were military or not, after a while they got pretty bored and they left. But it was something uncomfortable. And, if I hadn't been with someone like Razia, then it would have been a lot more problematic. But she obviously knows the camp and knows her way around. So those are some of the gender dimensions. Other gender dimensions, so I was only interviewing women. That was my project there. I didn't have a lot of time, so that was how I decided to limit the scope of my research there. And it was really difficult to interview the women without men around. So because I was I was a bit of a, ooh, this is exciting. We've got a foreigner in the camp, a bit of a novelty. People would come and have a look. And so my interpreter would have to keep asking men to leave, because obviously, in terms of ethical interviewing, when you're talking to women, and particularly if you want to talk about issues of sexual violence that had occurred, you want the women to be as comfortable as possible. So that was kind of an ongoing issue within it. So I said I would come back to the ethics issues. So the ethics requirements, remember that I said that they made me get my participant form translated into Bangla. And anyway, it's the first day I showed my forms to my interpreter, and I was told in no uncertain terms should I give them the Bangla version, only the English version. Definitely do not give them that version. So that was all just a complete waste of time to have done. And so I knew that already beforehand that the Rohingya, the majority of Rohingya are generally illiterate because of the fact that they have been denied education as part of the genocide process. So I had brought with me an ink pad so that they could, instead of signing, that they could put a thumbprint in. So I was prepared for that. However, what I wasn't prepared for that was there was one incident where a woman had agreed to interview me, and her husband came out and he saw the piece of paper and he panicked. He was really worried, and he thought that that piece of paper was something that would mean that they were going to be sent back to Myanmar. And that got me really thinking about the ethical side of it, and how, you know, a piece of paper is important in the global north, but how for these people, a piece of paper was something to be feared, because for him, and it didn't matter that we explained to him what we were doing and what the piece of paper was about from my university. He just didn't want to have a bar of it and wouldn't let his wife be interviewed. And, you know, that just felt awful, because I then felt like it was being unethical to force people to you know, sign this piece of paper. So to me, that was kind of a way of thinking about how our ethics structures are so rigid and don't allow for different circumstances. You know, a verbal agreement should be enough, actually, you know, as long as you've explained it properly. And the thing is that none of my interviewees anywhere ever read the form, because what I do is I talk them through it. I explain to them about my research and what I want to talk to them about, because it's such a sensitive subject. You know, you don't just sit down and shove a form in their face. And I explained this to the ethics committee, but they didn't really listen. And I said, you don't just shove a form in their face, like they never read it. Because what you need to do as an interviewer is create a rapport with your interviewees. And you don't do that by going, here's a piece of paper, read it. So you always talk them through it, you know, whether it's through an interpreter or not. So essentially all those pieces of paper, thanks, Stephanie, I see you, you know, become irrelevant in a sense. So yes, doing the interviews, as I said, a lot of interruptions. Privacy was an issue as well. Food and sanitation was a challenge. So I would take snacks every day. I'd actually brought food with me from Australia, and this was based on advice that I'd been given from humanitarian aid workers who work there. And so I'd actually brought things like muesli bars, because they said, you know, you can't get food when you're there. You know, there are no normal shops in the camp or anything like that. So I had that kind of food with me, which I then shared with my, you know, my driver and my interpreter who were with me. And we also stopped on the way and bought things like juice boxes and other things that we could, you know, small little cakes that we could give to the women that we interviewed. Sanitation, it depended where we were. Up in Camp 1, flushing toilets, fantastic. Down the bottom, not so great. So, you know, generally people tend to try to limit their liquid intake to try and avoid that. So basically, confronting the challenges, how do you do it? So essentially, what's essential is having local contacts for this, especially for this kind of research, but really any kind of research when you're going anywhere. You know, it puts you on the front foot, it makes things easier for you. Organize your interpreter in advance. If you can, it's definitely a good idea. Use your connections. And by that, I also mean researchers who have been there before. Ask them if they had an interpreter or a translator, if it's, you know, documentation, and, you know, who was reliable and who was good, because interpreters have different quality. So remember that an interpreter needs to interpret directly rather than, you know, summarizing what they think they hear for you. So that's quite important. If you can, do your ethics early, obviously, not 2 months before. And I just think, you know, as I said, talking about the ethics, I think that our ethics system needs to be more flexible than it is, to take into account, you know, non-Western, non-medical research, you know, qualitative research with vulnerable populations, essentially. My other advice is to talk to people who have been there. That was honestly the most helpful thing, to have had someone, and particularly it's someone I work with here on the Red Cross committee that I'm on, and so we could sit in person, which was a bonus, and just talk about what it was like in the camps and what the practicalities were, because it's such a challenging environment and it's such a different environment from researching any other genocide, you know, that's been in the past. Be prepared that others are not as organised as you, so even if you've communicated with them a couple of months in advance, you get there and they may not have actually done the things that they said they were going to do for you, so that can be quite frustrating. But remember though to be as organised as you can at your end, so do what you can there. And I just wanted to finish with this slide, which has the wonderful motivational signs that they have up in the Women's Centre, you know, really providing inspiration for the Rohingya women who are, you know, really just essentially learning some basic educational things and learning how to be leaders within their communities in the camps. Thank you.
Thank you, Mel. All three of these have been amazing presentations, and I loved, and the sidebar has just been like popping with everyone agreeing and sharing stories on, you know, their own IRB and all sorts of comments. So thank you very much. Most have been comments. I haven't actually seen any particular questions. We have about 11 minutes left, so if there's any questions, please feel free to pop them in the chat here. And I'm trying to hear that. But yes, thank you. And so while we're waiting,
I'm just going to say, I'm just, you know, just looking through the chat now, you know, it's really amazing to see other people who are seeing the similarities with what we've all experienced as well. I mean, obviously listening to Rachel and Sarah's presentations, I was thinking, yes, I relate to this, you know, so it's great to see that these kind of experiences are, you know, it's not unique, but that we're all experiencing them. And I think it's one of the reasons I wanted to run this panel was so that we could get the conversation going about the kinds of challenges that we all face and, you know, any kinds of solutions that people have found.
Which, as an aside, if anyone wants to reach out later or after the conference with their thoughts, comments, questions, I haven't done an awful lot of in-country research in a while, but I'm always happy to connect you towards other people. And I'm going to volunteer her that Holly Naismith-Brem is doing tremendous research in Rwanda right now and is someone that could also serve as a great resource. But what I appreciate, I mean, just to kind of comment, is that I was taking so many notes and I just really appreciated both the chat that was going on and also the amazing conversations across my two colleagues and co-presenters. So thank you, everyone.
Same. I have this whole like list of comments on myself. I have to say, since there's no questions at the moment, I really appreciate Rachel's comment on compensating individuals, because I experience that all the time in Rwanda. If people are taking their entire day off work and they're having, oftentimes, if they're meeting me somewhere other than their, you know, they're taking, I meet in memorials. So they're taking taxi, you know, moto taxis to the memorial itself. And I had to go a few rounds with IRB just to kind of understand that. I was like, no, I'm going to be paying them compensation for their taxis because otherwise I am taking advantage of them. And that goes into, although I think my IRB is fairly much nicer than Mel's, because I just told them I wasn't getting them to sign anything because I'm like, they can't read, you know, what language, you know, they speak 3 different languages. They can't read them, the target audience I'm interviewing, you know, and after my first time, they don't, you know, I explain to them and record the explanation, you know, so that they hear. But a lot of
Stephanie, I wish I'd had the chance. So I was communicating through the ethics office. So I wasn't communicating. I said to them, can I come and talk to the committee? can I come and talk to them about my research, because this is so different from what they have in their heads, and they wouldn't let me. And that, I think that would have helped as well. You know, again, this red tape. UWA is just so, everything's about policy and process, and it's just worse than any other uni I've been at. And, you know, just this, honestly, really stick up their backside about stuff. You know, and it's not that I'm not against ethics. As I said, you know, agree with Sarah, it's really, really important, but they need to have flexibility with, in terms of research that is, as I said, non-Western, non-health, non-medical research.
Well, and also don't impose Western standards that make it impossible or dangerous for the people who are going to be engaging in research with you in your country. So in the country where you're doing your research. So, I mean, that makes, it's just good sense.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Just, you know, a need for more understanding, I think. There's a paper here that we could all write, of course.
Oof, a scathing one. We name names. I don't want to interrupt the flow of conversation, but I do have to skedaddle. I'm so sorry for doing that. But I just thank you to everyone who participated, both as presenters or moderator. Stephanie, you did great. And then everyone who joined. I wish we were all in person right now to celebrate this.
Thanks, Sarah.
Bye, Sarah.
Bye.
Thanks for sharing your thoughts. It was great.
Thanks.
Yeah, I feel like there's so many issues. I mean, I've had issues doing research in Bosnia as well, and Cambodia. Cambodia, it tended to be the interpreters kept pulling out on the day. I would just get a message saying, "Oh, my dad is sick," which is like similar to what Sarah was talking about, the excuses in Rwanda. That's the excuse in Cambodia. And it would throw my research out, and it was really problematic, you know, because then you couldn't do the work that you needed to do because you didn't have the interpreter. It took me several goes to actually get one. And who ended up being, I mean, talking about ongoing issues and gender issues, becoming a little bit obsessed with me. And after I returned to Australia, he was emailing me frequently, telling me how much he missed me and how much he wanted me to meet his family that lived in Australia. And it became really uncomfortable. And I just ignored him until he stopped emailing me. And I think, you know, that's another reason why I recommend checking with other researchers who have been working in the country to find out, you know, who should I work with and who shouldn't I work with. And in fact, ironically, not really ironically, but in fact, another researcher contacted me something like a year or two after that and asked me for recommendation about this person. And I said, look, this is what happened to me. And so she also was then like, well, of course, I don't want to use him as an interpreter. You know, another gender issue. You know, so many things as a woman that make you uncomfortable when you're traveling. I really felt uncomfortable in Bangladesh, you know, staying in a hotel where there wasn't a single woman in that hotel anywhere, in the staff, in the restaurant, staying in the hotel. It was just me. And you know, at one point, I mean, this was basically every hotel, but in one hotel, at one point I went to my room and it was locked. They had wanted to just give me a message, but instead of leaving a note, they locked me out of my room. And things like that, when you're in a location like that, where it is, you know, it's a really patriarchal society, it's really, you know, it's a safety issue, safety and security issue. So all of these are just such challenges on a daily basis with field work.
And I think I want to echo something that Sara mentioned about, and that was mentioned in a few comments about getting about going to therapy. In fact, I've been doing research in Rwanda 6 years, interviewing genocide survivors. And actually, I believe it was you, Mel, who told me you need to go talk to a therapist. And I wanted to take you up on it because the transmitted stress after hearing so many stories for over such a prolonged period of time, really, it's probably one of the most important things I heard was just go talk to someone.
But the right therapist as well, I think, you know, I think therapists that have a specialism in, for example, like first responders, things like that, because I've had some pretty dodgy therapy experiences as well, where someone's not familiar with the kind of research that you do. So I think finding the right fit. I had a woman who became fixated on why I would research atrocity, and wanted to constantly investigate how that was connected to my own traumas, and would really try and return to my work frequently, even if we were talking about something else. So I think it's a delicate balance. Therapy is really important, but the right therapy, and actually some of the best experiences I've had outside the professional context are just having connections with other researchers and being able to just share experience, and by someone that, even if they haven't had the exact same experience, knows what you're talking about, has almost been more beneficial. And I echo Holly's point that we have to be careful about really advocating for therapy for our students, because this is a socioeconomic privilege, and not everyone can afford it. And so encouraging those relationship buildings and friendships and open communication about what you've experienced, I think, is also really important.
Yeah, Rachel, my therapist said to me, one of the things that helps is actually talking about it, just that itself, because we don't normally do that. I know we think we do that because we write up our research, but we don't really talk about, the real content of what we're exposed to. If you think about it, especially a lot of us do empirical research, we interview survivors, but we're also visiting sites, we're also looking at photographs of atrocities, we're watching videos of atrocities, we're reading reports of atrocities. It's kind of constant, even if we're not in the field, our work in our office is being exposed to it. So, but we don't really talk about it. We don't really sit and say, today I read this, for example, reading the forced marriage section of the Ongwen judgment, just an example, to say, today I sat and I read these awful stories about these girls who had been taken, and, just really talking about the details and how it affected us. That particularly is something that affected me, reading that, just the brutality, how awful Ongwen was. And so to find a space where you have someone where you can actually just talk about that is important in itself.
I think, we can't over emphasize the importance of sitcoms as well as a way of coping with fieldwork. I find that while I don't often get upset about the research when I'm doing it, I can no longer tolerate any realism in my media. I can't watch serious films, I can't watch serious TV plot lines. So the role of sitcom and sci-fi in therapeutic unpacking after conflict research is also an important thing to flag. And a Netflix, I'm being facetious obviously, but Netflix subscriptions are cheaper than therapy.
Yeah, I'm the same actually. I want something lighthearted, things like RuPaul's Drag Race, that kind of thing, just to get your head completely out of it and not think about it. Absolutely, yeah. I'm glad it's not just me.
Thank you, everyone. I'm going to stop our recording here and say thank you very much for an incredible presentation. This was, and by even seeing all the chats, it was highly interactive and very interesting for everyone. So I appreciate your presentations and thank you. And think maybe we should continue this conversation in Barcelona next time, even if it's coffee to discuss coping mechanisms for, and just talk to each other. All right, thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for coming.
Thanks for your sharing. It was excellent.